Scripture this morning comes from the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'll be reading verses 23 through 28. And again, using the Message Bible this morning. I think some of these recently, I think the Message Bible just really translates it in a way that makes it a lot easier to understand. And so I invite you to hear these words this morning from 1 Corinthians 11. Let me go over with you again exactly what goes on in the Lord's Supper and why it is so centrally important. I received my instructions from the Master himself and passed them on to you. The Master, Jesus, on the night of his betrayal, took bread. Having given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you. Do this to remember me." After supper, he did the same thing with the cup. "This cup is my blood, my new covenant with you. Each time you drink this cup, remember me." What you must solemnly realize is that every time you eat this bread and every time you drink this cup, you reenact in your words and your actions the death of the Master. You will be drawn back to this meal again and again until the Master returns. You must never let familiarity breed contempt. Anyone who eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Master irreverently is like part of the crowd that jeered and spit on him at his death. Is that the kind of remembrance you want to be part of? Examine your motives, test your heart. Come to this meal in holy awe. It's the word of God for us, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Now I know this is the middle of the month. And we're not used to seeing communion set up here in the middle of the month. Usually it's the first of the month. But I think there are a couple of wasps flying around. Just let them be. Maybe they'll be all right. But the last several weeks, and it seems like since I've been here, I've been kind of talking a lot about kind of getting back to the basics and how important that is. Getting back to the basics of who we are, what we're all about. Sometimes we can get too far along and think we're, doing pretty good, but when we forget the basics, we're in trouble. I know right after I got here, I started with, did a series on the mission statement of the Global Methodist Church to make disciples of Jesus who worship passionately, love extravagantly, and witness boldly. That's what we're here for. That's why we gather. And then the last several weeks, been looking at awakening from doctrinal amnesia. I love that phrase. And I heard it from one of my seminary professors at Hood, a man who loved Methodism. And there were points in time where he talked about Methodism and you could almost see him cry where, along the way we kind of lost our way. And you could see how much it meant to him. But it really goes back to, in finding our Methodist roots, it goes back to really finding scriptural Christianity. So I've been talking about, the distinctives of our Methodist theology, and really got started out talking about having a living faith because, you can have all the doctrine, you can have all the beliefs right, but if it's not married to a living faith, it means nothing. Living faith that doesn't just come here on Sunday mornings and, sit here, maybe sing a couple words, and, maybe listen to a few words from the preacher and then leave and not change anything the rest of the week. But a living faith that comes here to get the full armor of God so that we can go out into the world and battle for the Lord, knowing that He's with us and the Spirit's going to enable us to do everything we need to do. That's having a living faith. And then talking about what we really call in our Methodist tradition, the way of salvation. I might not use those words all the way through, but that's really what it is. Other traditions might talk about the plan of salvation. But that kind of implies more certain steps that you have to go through. You got to do this, you got to say these words, and and you're okay. But for us, it's a way of salvation because it really comes down to a relationship with God. Because it's all about God. And while other traditions might start with the idea that we're all sinners falling short of the glory of God, we start with the idea that God is love. Yes, we're sinners. Yes, without Him, we have no hope. But God. But God. God is love. And everything He does, every way He relates to us is out of that great love for us. And God's love is a seeking love. That is always calling us into a relationship. Before we ever know He's there, before we know we need Him, before we're ever even thought, He knows us and loves us. He knit us together in our mother's womb. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. He knows us and loves us. We call it prevenient grace, grace that comes before. Like being on the front porch of a house and God's calling us into the house. And then, we have to look at the fact that sin is very real. Without Christ, without His sacrifice, we have no hope. We can't even do the good that we want to do because we are so utterly in bondage to sin. But God, right? But God. God, to free us from that bondage, to help restore to us what He created in us at the very beginning, sent Jesus to be the sacrifice that we might be saved, that we might be forgiven, and we might be able to have a saving relationship with Him that leads into eternity. And that is where, when He's calling us into the house, that's where we step across the threshold, respond to His invitation, and into the house. Then that's where a lot of traditions stop. Because they're all concerned. There's a lot of traditions that are just concerned about getting you saved, just getting you in the door. But one of the things that is very distinctive about our Methodist, our Wesleyan tradition, is that we talk about moving on towards perfection. We talk about perfecting or sanctifying grace. Grace that helps us move on towards that maturity in love and God's love that He wants for us. Some traditions kind of, might look at that and think that we're trying to talk about works and somehow earning what God's given us, but everything is by His grace. It's His grace that enables us to move on towards perfection. And He has given us gifts that help us do that. As I talked about last week, it's, things like prayer. Prayer, having a conversation with God, listening to Him, talking to Him, just being in His presence. Those are so important. It's like a marriage. When you can have a great, beautiful wedding ceremony, but if you never go home, you never spend time with your spouse, that relationship's not going to grow. You need to be able to spend time with them. You need to be in conversation with them and grow together. So important. And so He's given us prayer and He's given us His Word right here. We can never say that, we haven't heard from God if we don't open up this book. Right here, He tells us everything that we need to know for life and for salvation. We need to open it. We need to read it. The more we read this book, the more we get to know the one who gave it. And of course, worship in public and in private. These are ways that God gives us grace to become stronger in our relationship with Him, become more like Him. And of course, the sacraments. In our tradition, we have two sacraments, baptism and communion. And we believe, as these are sacraments, these were given directly by Jesus, commanded by Him. And we believe that God's grace is in these sacraments in a very real way. Jesus Himself, He told the disciples, He said, go forth into all the world, make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I commanded you. He said, go forth and make disciples, baptizing them. So he commanded that, and then he also commanded them to partake of the communion meal. And that's something that has been given down through all of the centuries. It's a meal that we still partake in. But I think sometimes we kind of misunderstand it a little bit. It's lost its meaning in a lot of ways. It's not this week I'm going to talk about communion, and since we're talking about it, we're going to celebrate it. John Wesley actually recommended celebrating it at least once a week. Him for himself, he did it at least 3 or 4 times a week. In the U.S., in a lot of ways, growing up, we had about once a quarter. But that came down because that's the only reason it became once a quarter was because when there were circuit riders, they only came around about once a quarter. And so that's the only time they could receive communion. But that tradition held on even when the pastors started sticking around in churches. But we need to be willing to take communion as often as we can because it's so powerful. But if you're like me, growing up in the United Methodist Church, communion when I was younger, like I said, we took it about once a quarter, and it felt just like something you tagged on to the end of the service. You did the regular service, and then, we're going to take communion. And it didn't have the power. And I didn't, I understood the words of the liturgy. I kind of understood what we were talking about, but when we actually took communion, a lot of times we used the little cups and the little wafers. Now, we talked about bread, but that didn't taste like bread to me. Right? That tastes like cardboard. It does. I'm getting around it. We had that, and those little cups, I guess that was juice, but you barely have a taste of it. But there were so many things that we lost the meaning. And now a lot of places we gotten back into taking communion where you receive a piece of bread and you dip it in the juice, and it reminds us a little bit more of what it's all about. I did hear the story of a little girl that came forward for communion one Sunday and got this little piece of bread. And she said, "I want more, I want more." And probably embarrassed her parents. Maybe the preacher might have got a little chuckle out of it. But that sentiment probably something that a lot of us have understood. We want more. We got to know that there should be more to this meal. Why is it stuck around all these years? Why did Jesus command us to take this meal? It's because in this meal we receive the grace of God in a very real way. We call it a holy mystery. We don't fully understand it, but we know that God's presence is here. And it's Christ who invites us to his table. And we receive his grace in a way that it helps us to remember all that he did, his sacrifice for us, but it also helps us. It's grace that can help us to understand his call into the relationship. It can help us grow in our relationship with him. And we even believe that it can be a grace that helps convict us so that we accept his love and grace for us. We believe that God's grace is very powerful at this table. In a lot of ways, we've lost it. We got up there. Sometimes we come up and we take communion, but we don't really understand. And that's one thing that Paul was actually writing about here in 1 Corinthians. The people he was writing to, they didn't really understand what they were doing. He had commanded them, he had taught them, but they had gotten away from what they were taught. From one thing, one of the things that they did was they would tend to have a full meal, and some of them, they wouldn't wait for others. As soon as they got there, they'd start. And there were some of them, especially the richer among them, would start without the poor among them, and they would get full. They were getting drunk off the wine. They didn't understand what it was all about. And so he wanted to make sure that they understood. So he came back and he said, I'm going to tell you again what it's all about. He wanted them to understand. I already told him, he said, it's not about taking a full meal. This is something special. He said, you've got your houses to eat your meals in. He said, this is a special meal. This is a special thing. He said, I want you to know exactly what goes on in the Lord's Supper and why it is so centrally important. And he said, he goes on to say, I've received my instructions from my master himself, and I passed them on to you. And yet he again tells the story when Jesus was with his disciples in that upper room, his last meal with him. He took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, he gave it to them. He said, they can eat this. Do this in remembrance of me. And he took the cup and he said, this is my blood of the new covenant. Do this in remembrance of me. He said, always do this in remembrance of me. He said, what you must solemnly realize is that every time you eat this bread and every time you drink this cup, you reenact in your words and actions the death of our Master. You will be drawn back to this meal again and again until he comes. There's a reason why we keep coming back to the communion meal. He said, but here, I love the way this is phrased. He says, don't let familiarity breed contempt. So that's something that in a lot of churches it has just become something that we do, and it doesn't have a meaning. Maybe familiarity has bred contempt in a lot of ways. There's been times in this country when they know it's Communion Sunday, there's not as many people in church. You ever seen that? Because people don't really understand it, so they don't show up that Sunday. But that should be the day when more of us are here, because we should be eager to partake of communion. He said, anyone who eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Master irreverently is like part of the crowd that jeered and spat at Jesus. So I said, that's not the kind of remembrance we want. Examine your motives, test your heart, come to this meal in holy awe. He reminds them how important this is. It's a time when we remember everything that Jesus did and it becomes part of a living history. It's the only way that I really know how to explain it. It's like a living history. It represents to us the sacrifice of Jesus. It makes it present, makes it current for us here and now. In much the same way that the Passover meal did for the Israelites, for the Jews. And that's what Jesus was celebrating with his disciples, and that's what he changed to what we know as the communion meal. For them, we know the story of how the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt. And God had heard the cry of the Israelites in slavery. He had heard their suffering, and he sent Moses to Pharaoh to make Pharaoh let the people go. And of course, Pharaoh didn't want to do it, and so God had to try to get his attention. And Pharaoh didn't want to give. And finally, God had to take drastic measures. And the angel of death visited the firstborn of the people of Egypt. But the people of Israel, they made a sacrifice. And they painted the blood of the lamb around the doorposts, so the angel of death would pass over their houses. And because of that, Pharaoh finally said, get out of here. And so God commanded them to keep this ritual to celebrate the Passover meal. And what it did, they had very specific, parts of the meal were very scripted. And people would have responses. Those, there was a leader, and there were, and the others there would respond. But what it did was it reminded them of the night that that last night there in Egypt, and it made it like a present reality for them. It reminded them that God had worked for them on their behalf before. That He had delivered them before, and it made it that present reality to remind them that He would do it again. Which was a comforting for them, as that, at the time of Jesus, they were now under Roman rule. But it made it like a living history for them. And that is what Jesus took to make them, communion as we know it. As they were taking the meal, He was the leader, and so He had the scripted parts, and then they would respond. And there were a couple of places in there where He went off script. And they were probably like, "What? Wait a minute, what you doing? That's not the words." They knew the words very well. So while they were eating, He took the bread and He broke it, He gave thanks, and He said, "This is my body which is broken for you." And they were like, "What are you talking about?" Jesus was giving them something that they could hold on to. I mean, as if you look at bread, in some ways you can see some similarities there, right? That's something that they could hold on to and remember what's about to happen to Him, that His body is about to be broken. And in the same way with the cup after dinner, He gave thanks for the cup, for the wine. And again, if you look at wine, it very much resembles blood, right? And so He was giving them something that they could hold on to. He changed the script. But He was giving them something that when they did this, He commanded, when they received the bread and the wine, that it would remind them of what He did. Remind them of His sacrifice, but make it more than just a history lesson. Make it a very present reality. We know that, the breaking of bread, we experience the presence of Jesus. Where we see Him. Even going back to the Emmaus experience right after Jesus' death and resurrection, it was in the breaking of bread that those disciples who were going to Emmaus, they recognized Him and knew exactly who He was. It's in coming to this table we receive His grace. He is the host. We remember His sacrifice. We remember His body that was broken. We remember His blood that was shed. And He offers us grace. There's, all kinds of ways you can kind of get into it, even, very, very in depth. There's some that believe it actually literally changes into the body and blood of Christ. But for us, we believe that it is a spiritual reality. That it becomes, for us, the body and blood of Christ spiritually. And so the more we take in of Christ, the more we become like Him. And if you come and you take this meal sincerely, there is no way that you cannot be changed by this meal. And the more that we take of this meal, the more often we take it, the more often we become, or the more we become like Christ Himself. This is one of the ways that God has given us, and we can experience His grace in a very real way. And I pray that we never lose. I know, there's a lot of things in the life of the church, sometimes they just become rituals. They become things that we do. And communion in some ways has become that. And I pray we never take it for granted. And I know, we've got the liturgy and the hymnal. I've kind of gotten away from using that liturgy so much that you might have noticed that. Because sometimes we know the words and we've said them. Most of us said them all of our lives. We know the words. But what matters is coming to this table, remembering and making present here and now what God has done for us. The sacrifice Jesus' body, Jesus' blood, broken and shed for us. That we can be forgiven, that we can have a saving relationship. A relationship that starts in here and now and moves into eternity. And as we receive this meal today, every time we receive this meal, I hope we come to this table knowing that we might not understand everything, but knowing that it is Christ himself who meets us here. And as Christ who invites all to his table. All those who earnestly repent of their sins and seek to live in peace with Christ and one another. And he invites all. And as we come, we receive his grace. As we come, he meets us